Hello and welcome everybody to the first session in our series, Demystifying Trust-Based Philanthropy. The first question we will be answering and tackling today is, does trust-based philanthropy mean unconditional trust? We are so excited for this session and for this series. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Shantia Ford, and I'm the Director of Programs here at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. As a visual descriptor, I am a Black woman sitting behind a white wall with some artwork and some diplomas. I have on a Black shirt and a red Fenty lip that I've been getting a lot of compliments on, so thank you. This is my lucky lipstick, by the way. For my land acknowledgement, I'm currently residing on Lenni Lenape Native land, which is currently known as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I greet you all. Feel free to continue introducing yourselves in the chat. We're so excited to have you. There's been so much energy and excitement around this topic. And so we're excited to just dig in with you all. Just a little bit of meeting housekeeping. Of course, please keep your microphones muted. Continue to engage in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that, the staff. Please use it for any questions, comments, if you want to be a amen corner and cheer people on as they say certain things. Please feel free to use the chat for that. Please ensure you're using the most current version of Zoom, especially for the breakouts we're going to have at the end. We just want to make sure you can get into the right rooms and don't have any technology issues there. We do have live transcription that's available for this event. So to enable live captioning, please navigate to the meeting controls toolbar and click the show captions icon. If you have any other accessibility needs, please do reach out to either myself and the DMs or my email or my colleague Danielle. We're happy to assist you with anything you may need. The session will be recorded and we will be posting it on our website under the resources tab for those of you that may have to drop off or that may miss part of it, or for some of your colleagues you may want to share this information with. You will have that option to share that. And we encourage you to join us on social media. Please feel free to tweet. We'll be having some live tweeting going on. If you want to post something to LinkedIn, please feel free to join in on that and use our hashtag for that. I've already introduced myself, but I want to give a big shout out to the entire Trust-Based Philanthropy Project staff. As you can see on the screen here, we have some amazing folks that have been really working to make this learning series and everything happen for you all. And I won't go through and introduce all of them for the sake of time, but we're all here to support you all. So if you need anything, please do reach out to any of us for support. So just to quickly outline the series, what we really decided to do with this learning series is to give you all an opportunity. We've heard you all on some of the questions and the things that you've been grappling with as you're trying to operationalize trust-based philanthropy, as you're trying to figure out what it means to be a trust-based practitioner. And so we've heard some of the common questions, some of the common misperceptions, some of the things that people are saying that aren't necessarily right. And we understand that trust-based philanthropy is very nuanced. There are some different things that need a little bit more clarity. And so we decided to develop this learning series to give you all the answers to some of the questions you've been grappling with, some of the things we're not necessarily getting exactly right, or some of the common misperceptions that people are saying. And so we just wanted to give the space for that. And we're kicking it off with this first session. Does trust-based philanthropy mean unconditional trust? And one of the things we commonly hear from critiques and people just grappling with it is, oh, this is calling for a blind trust from your grantees. And we intentionally did not use blind trust because that language is ableist. But the gist of it is, it's asking, do we unconditionally trust our grantees? So we'll spend some time today talking about what that means, what trust-based philanthropy calls for, and what it doesn't call for. The second session in the series, and all of these are spaced about 3 weeks apart. The second session, we'll be talking about unrestricted funding. does unrestricted funding automatically make a funder trust-based? We've had some conversations around that. That's one of the things funders are really grappling with is unrestricted funding. And so we'll spend some time talking about that. The third session in the series will be about how we approach risk and due diligence and that process. And we know there are a lot of questions around that. And how do I do a due diligence process if I'm being a trust-based funder? How do I reconcile the two? What do I continue to do? What do I leave off? And so we'll spend some time discussing that as well. The fourth session in the series talks about what does grantee accountability look like in a trust-based philanthropy practice. So a lot of times people are asking questions around, how do I hold my grantees accountable? How do I make sure they're doing the things I asked them to do? And that session will really get to that, to answering that and what it looks like to have mutual accountability in a funder-grantee relationship. That fifth session, what does evaluation look like in a trust-based context? It's going to be a great session. We know there are a lot of questions around measuring impact and thinking of this false dichotomy between impact and rigor and trust-based philanthropy. And so we'll really spend some time talking about why that's not the case. And then finally, what does racial equity have to do with trust-based philanthropy? We get a lot of questions around racial equity work, what that looks like, people conflating trust-based philanthropy with racial equity work, people thinking trust-based philanthropy is the first step to racial equity work. And so we'll spend some time just sharing the correlation between the two and then also the differences. So these are just some of the questions we hear from you all commonly. And we want to take some time to really clarify the misperceptions and to answer some of your questions there. So that is the learning series. We hope you will join us for all of the sessions. And again, if you have to miss one, if you have to step out, we will have these recorded and available on our website for you to look at afterwards. So for today's agenda, we'll spend some time in the opening, which we're doing right now. And then we'll have some grounding context from our lovely executive director, Shadi. Then we'll spend some time in a panel discussion. We have some amazing speakers that are going to share from their experiences. And then we'll have some time with PSO breakout discussions, which I'll talk about in just a moment. To speak on our speakers, we have some amazing speakers that are here that are going to share their insights. We have Yolanda Cointreau, who is the president and CEO at the Institute for Nonprofit Practice. And we're so grateful to have you here with us. We have Phil Lee, the president and CEO of the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation. He's also on our steering committee and a TBP champion. And we have Pia Infante, who's the senior fellow here at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project and also a TBP champion and one of our founders. And so we're so excited to have these amazing people here to share their insights and their expertise in answering this question with us. And a big, huge thank you to all of our philanthropy serving organization partners. We have 19 partners that have come together with us to partner with us for this amazing event. You've shared it on your listservs. You really advocated for this and encouraged your members to join, and we just appreciate your partnership. At the end of our series, we'll have time for you to join your PSO organizations and have some conversation, have some dialogue, get some questions answered, engage with the content a little bit. So if you see one that you're involved in, we encourage you, even if you didn't put it in your registration, we encourage you to go to those breakout rooms. So we'll give you more instructions on how to do that at the end. But yeah, thank you again to our PSO partners. We deeply appreciate your partnership. So to give a little bit of grounding before we jump into things, we know people are coming from a lot of different places in their trust-based philanthropy journey and in what they're really looking to get out of this. We know some people have been practicing this for a while and some people are completely new to this work. So we just want to give a little bit of grounding to what trust-based philanthropy is. And then we'll jump into the content. So to give that initial grounding, what trust-based philanthropy really is about addressing those inherent power imbalances that we see in the philanthropic sector between funders and the nonprofits, the communities they're aiming to serve. There is this power imbalance that we see. And trust-based philanthropy really calls for redistributing that power, both systemically, organizationally, and interpersonally, really acknowledging that there is a power dynamic and doing what we can to right-size that power dynamic, particularly through the relationships that we build and the ways that we operate in the philanthropic sector. A lot of you know about our practices, and part of this series is going to be around addressing the practices and addressing and understanding that trust-based philanthropy is more than just the practices. But on a practical level, that does include some of those practices we talk about often, such as multi-year unrestricted funding, streamlining applications, streamlining reporting, alternative reporting, and building those relationships based on transparency, dialogue, and mutual learning, all in the spirit of humility. Trust-based philanthropy is a values-based approach, and these are just the values that trust-based philanthropy practitioners and we as trust-based philanthropy, the project, we operate in, such as working for systemic equity, redistributing power, centering relationships, partnering in the spirit of service, being accountable, and embracing learning. And this is just a quick overview. If you do need more of that, grounding information, you can find plenty of resources on our website. And as we dig into these sessions, you'll also learn more about what trust-based philanthropy is. There are 4 dimensions of trust-based philanthropy that we encourage our funders to operate in, to really think about ways to operationalize trust-based philanthropy. It's not just the practices, which we often think about and gravitate towards, but it's also the culture, your organization's culture, how you operate, the structures, those structures in place, the hierarchies and the systems of power and privilege that we operate in every day. And then it's also about the leadership. We're definitely calling for trust-based leaders, and we're thinking about how leadership really plays a part in what it means to be a trust-based organization and to do trust-based funding. So my colleagues will get more into the 4 dimensions of TBP and what it means to be a trust-based funder. But we want to first kick it off with an opening poll, just to see where people are, where they're sitting in the room with this question. So the question is, how confident are you that you can answer the question, does trust-based philanthropy mean unconditional trust? So first option, very confident. You could answer this question in detail. This is not just a yes or no question. Of course, there is nuance to this. That's why we're having a whole session on it. So maybe you're confident and you could say in detail why it does or doesn't mean unconditional trust. Maybe you're somewhat confident. Maybe you have an idea of what the answer is, but could use more talking points, could use more clarity, could use a deeper understanding. Or maybe you don't know. Maybe this is a misperception that you definitely have and you've been grappling with it and don't know how to answer this question at all. And maybe that's why you're here. So I see a good amount of people taking the poll. I'll wait a second longer for people to continue putting that in, but I'm definitely seeing a general bell curve. About 75% right now are saying that somewhat confident piece. So I will go ahead and end the poll and share out those results. Thank you for those of you that took the poll. So yeah, we have about 75% that are somewhat confident, about 10% that are very confident, and we appreciate you here with us today. Please feel free to engage in the chat, share your insights as well. This is a collective learning process, so we'd love to hear from you as well. And then about 15% of you are not confident, and we're definitely glad you're here with us, and we hope after this session, you'll be able to more confidently answer that question. So with that grounding, I want to go ahead and pass it to our esteemed executive director, Shadi Salehi, who is going to give us some grounding context on this. Thank you, Shadi. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Shantias, and good day, everyone. It is so wonderful to be with you, all 646 of you. And thank you, Shantias, for such a great grounding and background on trust-based philanthropy, and some of the kind of core misperceptions we'll be addressing with this series. So I am Shadi Salehi. I am the executive director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. I am an Iranian woman with long brown hair. I'm wearing a mock turtleneck shirt with navy blue and gray stripes, and I am sitting in an office with a white background. I'm joining you from San Francisco, California, also known as the unceded land of the Ohlone people, and very delighted to be with you all today. So to reinforce kind of why we're exploring this question, it's really, it's here to address one of the most common misperceptions we have witnessed, heard, and observed when it comes to understanding trust-based philanthropy. There is this assumption that it's about kind of this unbridled trust, this unconditional trust. And, and that can be perceived as a very willy-nilly practice. Today, we're here to really unpack what we mean by trust and why trust has been one of the core values and core words that we use to describe this approach. And I'll invite you to take us to the next slide, please. So as Shantias described, trust-based philanthropy is at its core a values-based approach. So what that means is that it's ultimately about leaning on values of trust, equity, relationship to guide the multiple dimensions of philanthropic practice. So in many ways and in many contexts, people understand this as the 6 grant-making practices of trust-based philanthropy, like multi-year unrestricted funding and streamlined applications and reports. However, really the core of trust-based philanthropy is about leaning on values to guide the whole of our work. So how we build our organizational cultures, how we establish and envision and build our organizational structures, and how we as leaders, regardless of what role or positionality we hold within an organization, how we as leaders can model and uphold those values. So in trust-based philanthropy, we're really looking at and leaning on trust as one of the core values among several that we kind of look to guide the way we operate and interact with one another, the way we operate and interact with other organizations. So it's a core value that becomes kind of central to how we interact, not just between funders and grantees, but also with colleagues, with partners, and how these values can be manifest in our structures. Next slide, please. So one of the most important things to recognize and understand when we're talking about trust-based philanthropy is that this is truly a two-way street. Trust is built between 2 or more entities. And so that's an exchange, that's an interchange, that's a two-way process. It's not unidirectional. Often in trust-based philanthropy, we're focused in on the importance of funders trusting grantees. The reason why we make that emphasis is because a lot of the traditional structures and expectations and norms in philanthropy and the philanthropy ecosystem, they often lead from a place of distrust. This is often represented in the way that organizations or nonprofits are required to jump through a lot of hoops to prove their worth, have to submit many, many reports and evidence and metrics multiple times a year to kind of prove their worthiness. Often nonprofits are under a lot of scrutiny by foundations and funders in order to give funders the peace of mind that they're trustworthy enough to receive funds. And even once they receive funds, there's constant monitoring, there's constant compliance, kind of enforcement that really reinforces actually a sense of distrust in the relationship. And why is that problematic? Because if we are, as funders, intending to support good work and advance progress on social change, and support organizations in being able to advance progress on social change, we must rely on the relationship in order to be able to deliver on those end goals. relationships are one of the most important currencies that we use in our daily work, because everything that we do requires relationships. Getting anything done requires relationships. And when there's not trust existing in those relationships are weaker and they're not able to deliver on the end goals. So one of the things that we're really kind of core to this approach is just acknowledging that trust is a key aspect of a healthy relationship, and we need healthy relationships in order to advance on these big social change goals that we're all collectively working on in philanthropy and in the nonprofit ecosystem. But trust is a two-way street, right? It's not only about funders trusting grantees, even though that's a big part of what we focus on because of the historic systemic distrust that has existed from funder to grantee, from foundation to nonprofit. But on the other side, there is also the need and the need to give space for nonprofits to cultivate a sense of trust toward funders. And the reason why this is an area that we wanted to spend a little time talking about today is because for many nonprofits, especially nonprofit leaders of color, they have periodically and continuously experienced harm and distrust from philanthropy, or even being overlooked by foundations, being underfunded, ignored. So there are many people in the nonprofit ecosystem, many organizations that haven't had positive experiences with the foundation world or with philanthropy. And so there may be a slower pace of being willing to trust because of past harms. And so we need to acknowledge that this trust is a two-way street and it takes time to cultivate. Even if a funder is ready and willing to lead from a place of trust, we cannot assume that nonprofits will always be ready to trust. And while this might seem a little disheartening, I hope it can also be understood as a bit of common sense that sometimes trust is uneven. As you think about your own personal experiences and your personal relationships, trust is not always exactly even. But we need to name this because there is inherently a power imbalance. And part of the rigor of trust-based philanthropy is in the cultivation of trust and the maintenance of trust and the tending to that. Next slide, please. And so it is a false dichotomy to think about, it's like all or nothing trust, like you either trust or you don't trust. But the reality is it's super nuanced. It's not about like we're all in or we're not in at all. It's really something that requires cultivation. Next slide, please. So it's like a garden, right? I've like many of us, I took up house plants during the pandemic, and I've really learned that you got to give light and soil, and sometimes you got to move the plant to a bigger pot. This is the pardon the horrible metaphor. I'm not really a true gardener, but trust is not something that you like set and forget. It requires cultivation and maintenance. And in the funder-grantee relationship, or in any power imbalance relationship, it's important for those who hold the power to really kind of take on some of that onus of the cultivation of trust, of the maintenance, of the checking in on it. But again, it is still a two-way street, but recognizing that even in these power imbalance relationships, sometimes that puts on a little bit more onus on the funder side to really think intentionally about how are we going to prioritize cultivating and maintaining trust. Next slide, please. Also, a very important point here, trust requires a racial equity lens. Trust requires a systemic equity lens. So this is kind of a theme that I've already been mentioning about kind of the power imbalances that show how power imbalance manifests in creating conditions for trust. And there have been some critiques and misperceptions that trust-based philanthropy can favor those who already have relationships with funders. Trust-based philanthropy perpetuates bias because it's only favoring those that already have an in with funders. It's only about funders kind of picking grantees that they like. These are all misnomers. This is not true. We are here to demystify that. And this is why we really emphasize that trust requires this racial equity lens. Because if you think about it, You know, what are the conditions that create opportunities for trust just from the get-go? In general, research shows people are generally more likely to trust in instances when they have familiarity or shared history with another person. That's kind of like natural human condition. We operate in a sector where white dominant norms have really kind of informed all of the structures and norms and cultures and behaviors that we have come to espouse as the way to be in the nonprofit sector. And so too, do white dominant norms shape what we deem trustworthy and what we deem as not so trustworthy. And so both anecdotally and statistically, Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience disproportionately more distrust in philanthropy. This can be seen in the data of looking at the dearth of funding that goes to Black-led organizations, even less goes to Indigenous-led organizations. It can be demonstrated in some of the research that's been done by the Building Movement Project on Race to Lead, where there's higher rates of burnout among people of color in the nonprofit sector. So there's a lot of manifestation, and a lot of that is due to funder relationships and interactions. And this is not to kind of point a finger at any individual. This is really just to recognize that the norms that have shaped what deems an organization trustworthy, how they dress, how they talk, how they show up, how they're able to write up a narrative proposal, these are all informed by white dominant norms. Moreover, our sector is a predominantly white sector where the vast majority of people who are in decision-making roles are white people. And this is shifting and evolving, and that's great. And it also requires an understanding of these systemic inequities and understanding how implicit bias might come into play when we think about trust and untrustworthiness and trustworthiness. So this is pretty deep and nuanced work. I don't want to boil it all down to one slide. We also have a whole session, as Shantius described, at the very end of our series in August that will really unpack the intersection of trust-based philanthropy and racial equity. But we would be remiss to not mention that this lens is a key requisite of thinking about practicing and extending trust in a trust-based philanthropy context. Next slide, please. So the other thing, in a trust-based philanthropy context, we're talking about leading from a place of trust and not kind of having trust be the end goal. And what we mean by this is, again, acknowledging that a lot of the traditional approaches in philanthropy tend to lead from a place of distrust. So kind of flipping that and just saying, hey, why don't we just start by trusting that this leader is going to deliver on what they say they're going to do, and start there, and then see how that relationship unfolds, and let's see what impact is made possible as a result of that. It's not, and then of course the cultivation is this ongoing thing, but we're not talking about, sometimes we get questions asking, well, how do we find the organizations that we can trust? That's a question that we've heard from funders. And our answer to that is start from a place of trust and see what happens and see what's possible. And that might sound super radical, but as we just found in our recently released report surveying 400 grant makers around the US and abroad, there are more and more of us, more and more of you who are leaning toward trust-based philanthropy. So more and more of us are seeing the power and the potential of leading from a place of trust, which is incredibly exciting and powerful. Next slide, please. All right, so that was our kind of grounding, and I'm so happy to introduce our fabulous panelists here, and we're gonna take the slides off so you can see their lovely faces. Welcome, Phil Lee, President and CEO of the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation, Pia Infante, Senior Fellow with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project and formerly Co-Executive Director of the Whitman Institute, and Yolanda Coentro, the President and CEO of the Institute for Nonprofit Practice. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your perspectives on this topic, because this is really why I think everyone is here, to hear from you all and put some color and dimension to the depth of what we're talking about here and really unpacking the depth of what it means, what trust means in this context of trust-based philanthropy. So for our viewers today, participants today, just to let you know, we're going to be engaging in a 45-minute discussion with the panelists. I have some pre-selected questions, but we also invite you to share your questions. So Shantius and I will be looking, we'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll be looking at weaving in some of your questions. So we'll try to bring those in. We won't have a dedicated Q&A section unless we miraculously have a little bit of extra time. So please use the chat. And if you would rather do it in some other way, you are welcome to email one of our team members and we'll try to accommodate you if you're unable to include your question in the chat. Okay, so Phil, Pia, Yolanda, thank you so much for being here. I want to just kind of start off by just having all three of you reflect on this question. Does trust-based philanthropy mean unconditional trust? And Yolanda, I would love to start with you, and then we'll hear from the others after.
Sure. So thanks for having me. This is a real gift to be in this conversation and to see so many people here interested in these practices and in this movement. So thank you. I've thought a lot about the title of this workshop today. And I think, my answer is just like kind of at the basic level, clearly, no. Trust-based philanthropy isn't about unconditional trust, not in my experiences, a grantee for sure, but certainly in my conversations with funding partners as well. Trust is like in any other format or any other relationship we might have, it's earned, it's built, it's something that when it's broken, it needs repair. It's delicate, it needs care and a tact to kind of continue to build and sustain it. And so I think it can't just simply be assumed, right? It's not like unconditional love of a child. It's not unconditional. We're at this together all the time. And especially as the context around us shifts and there's uncertainty or crises or other things come our way, it becomes even more important that we're working to keep our trust kind of strong and growing. I also think that this idea that like it's unconditional almost like diminishes the skill and the intentionality and the expertise that's really required to implement a trust-based approach across a foundation and an organization. It's like the simplicity of the word is an asset, but it's also a risk. Like the asset is that people can understand the word trust, but the risk is that we might oversimplify what it takes to build and sustain the practice of trust in the context of our work together as grantees and funders.
Thank you so much. I would love to come back to some of those points because you're raising such important points about just how nuanced this is. Thank you so much, Yolanda. Phil, how would you respond to this question? Does trust-based philanthropy mean unconditional trust?
I definitely would follow on what Yolanda is talking about and what you were saying earlier, that this whole notion that it is unconditional from the get-go, I don't think we see that in pretty much any relationship that we have, right? And we hear that statement often that it takes a long time to earn the trust of somebody, but it can go away very quickly. And this whole notion that why would trust-based philanthropy be different from the way that we look at trust in our lives? And I think that's maybe people take that word and sort of put it in like some special category and make it mean something perhaps different than it is intended to do. And often, maybe we are personalizing it in the ways that we trust others and perhaps our closest friends or our family and things like that. And so I think that conflation, taking trust and trust-based philanthropy to mean the same thing, is I think where we may take that wrong turn in that. But just sort of building on something that you were saying earlier, Shadi, and it was this whole notion that we as funders have the opportunity to grant trust or give trust and do that, because we actually sit in a place where we have that discretion, we have that ability to make that decision. And I think that's a really important thing for us to know, right? It does not have to be reciprocity in the way is a two-way straight yes. But the power dynamic alters that in some way, where we as funders can give trust and extend ourselves in that way. And our grantee partners in some ways have the opportunity to make an assessment whether we are trustworthy, right? And so in that way, that earning that trust is part of the equation there. And so I guess, I think what it means for us as funders is that we need to extend ourselves or become the ones where we do what we try to do at Robert Stone Clark, is be vulnerable first and share that we're not perfect and that we understand that there are flaws, and to sort of show that we can be open and share things. We wrote a whole blog series called Face Plants about all the mistakes that we made and some of our colleagues, and to be and public, put it out there. I think those kinds of things are just reminders that we're all human. And for some reason, when we get into these philanthropic funding relationships, sometimes things get so distorted and extremed in some way. And so I think part of this is like realizing that trust, like anything else in this world, is kind of part of human nature, and it can come and it can go, and it takes a lot of work and nurturing, just as Yolanda was saying.
I love that, Phil. And we've heard from others who describe trust-based philanthropy as just a human approach to philanthropy. And that really speaks to what you were describing. Pia, same question for you, and also kind of a related question. As the original architect of the trust-based philanthropy kind of framework, you've been credited with naming trust-based philanthropy. I'm hoping you can also share a little bit of background on how and why you honed in on trust as the key word in trust-based philanthropy.
Thanks, Shadi. Thanks, Yolanda. And Phil, thanks everyone for being here. I think I do want to start with the birthplace of the phrase trust-based philanthropy. So it came because our foundation, the Whitman Institute, based in San Francisco, decided to spend out its endowment. And so one of the first things we did, because we held a deep value of accountability to the communities that we supported through the nonprofits that we funded, is we asked them to give us some marching orders for what to do with the rest of our life as a foundation. And what came back.
Oh no, I think we may have lost Pia. I know she was having some Wi-Fi issues. Pia, we lost you, so you might want to go off video and maybe we can hear you then. Okay, we're going to give her a couple minutes to come back. I know the story, the origin story, so I'm going to do my best to channel Pia and fill in the gaps on this story. So as you're all on the edge of your seats, what came back, the results from this study, the kind of getting feedback from the grantees? And two things came back, actually. One thing was the recurrence of the word trust in the survey results among the grantees of the Whitman Institute. Basically, there was this kind of repeated continuous sentiment among the Whitman Institute's grantees that how powerful it was for them to feel that they had the trust of their funder, and how that enabled them to do the work, and how it alleviated them from all these other stresses and concerns so that they could focus on their work. And then the other thing that came back was a resounding request among all the former grantees of the Whitman Institute that the foundation should spend its remaining time as a foundation advocating for trust-based philanthropy and encouraging more, well, it didn't have a name then, but advocating for the way that they funded. And I believe Pia is back, so if we can get her spotlighted.
I am so sorry. My Wi-Fi just decided to go out. So now I'm just in from my cell phone. Did you continue the story, Shadi?
I did. I shared the two lessons that came out of this study, but I'll hand it back to you. Thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Sorry about that. So essentially there were lessons from the study that, strategy, or like a peer influence strategy. And some of the words that came back in very sort of bold letters were that the Whitman Institute approached philanthropy or giving in a very collaborative way, in a very relational way, and in a very trust came up over and over again. And it came up and it was significant because it wasn't a word that was always or often used to describe funder-grantee relationships. So at the time that we were naming this peer sort of influence effort many years back, a decade back, we were choosing between relationship, emphasizing that we were talking about, relationships of mutuality, relationships of parity, relationships of learning, and trust. And we ended up choosing trust as a word, as a concept, because it was so evocative. There's something about relationship-based philanthropy that feels a little bit like, what are you talking about? And even with trust-based philanthropy, we're here to demystify and define it better. But I think trust is evocative. We have a felt sense of whether or not we have it. We're losing it, we're gaining it. It's visceral. And it evoked a really interesting response, even among our board at the time, who said, that it overly.
Okay, we are having technical difficulties again. So Pia, we cannot hear you. So I'm going to move on to a question and then hopefully you can tune back in. Phil, I want to turn to you next. We're getting a question in the chat that I wanted to address because we're offering some grounding on why trust, why we've even focused in on this. But I know, as we always do in these programs, we want to get really practical. And I'm hoping, Phil, you can share with us, what does trust-based philanthropy look like in practice as a funder? And how is it different from traditional or kind of, the other version of philanthropy that is not trust-based? How do you practice this as a funder?
So what I'll share is a little bit how we do it at Robert Sterling Clark. And that's just, and I think one thing that I'll caveat is that trust-based philanthropy feels extremely specific and delineated in a particular way. And it's actually much more flexible than that. And funders can do them in different ways and the expressions of them can come out. And so even if you look at the different practices, the 6 of them, they can actually be interpreted many different ways. And so I just use that as a starting point. But for us at Robert Sterling Clark, and this is largely based on my own experience as a grant seeker and being the ED of an organization and what it was like to be in a situation where the interrogation and the multitude of questions and opinions and things like that came back at me was an invitation to think differently about that. And that informs a lot of the way that we do our work. And so I think for us, in terms of trust-based, if you look at the larger system, like we're working for social change, or we're looking at systems change. And a large part of that is like, so let's let our grantee partners focus on the work and not us, right? And that's part of that. And so for us, we have a very streamlined application process. The folks can share anything that they've supplied to anybody else as an application. And so it's really an upload. Our instructions are really saying, please share something that represents you well and reflects our interest. And that's it. And that's their application for the most part. Our belief is really that 90% of everything that's asked is pretty much the same. It's just sliced and diced in different ways. And so why don't we take the responsibility and the onus on us as the funder to get to know the organization rather than forcing them to do all this stuff just for us. A large part of our own belief system is that the folks who are doing this work in community and on the ground have a better understanding of what needs are than we do. And so why would we be the ones to prescribe what needs to happen and determine how the allocation of funds and resources should be? The whole idea of trust in this case is like, we trust that you understand and know what needs to happen and that you can deploy those resources, those grant funds in the right way to make all that stuff happen. And so for us, all of our grants are unrestricted in that way, and they're multi-year so that folks can actually take the time or make some decisions in terms of whether it's hiring or strategy or experimenting to do this work to see what might happen in community. And so really the whole notion of trusting community, and there was a question of related to that. That's really at core and central to a lot of this work. It really is captured in that essence there, right? And so those are just a couple of things. Reporting is a different, similar to that. But the real idea is that our grantees have a much better understanding of what is happening in community and what might need to be done than we do. And so why not trust them to make those decisions and do that work? And so that's how we come into the space.
Thank you so much, Phil. That's really a helpful overview. And just a few things I want to lift up. Trust-based philanthropy does not look identical across organizations, as Phil mentioned. There's many different expressions of it. It's about leaning on these values and integrating them into the way they show up in your grant-making systems. So I see a question around, is trust-based philanthropy just about general operating support? Unrestricted funding is a key component of a trust-based approach. It's not the only thing, but it is one way, as Phil described, one way of extending and signaling that we trust you, nonprofit, to make your decisions and determine where these resources go. So it's one expression of many. Pia, since we've got you back, was hoping you could reflect a little bit too on how you see trust-based philanthropy kind of practically different from some traditional approaches to philanthropy.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for your patience, everyone. I mean, you said it at the beginning, there's sort of a humanity to it. So some of the things that Phil, you're describing about it, having empathy for being in the position of being a fundraiser, even having an understanding of what it means to be an executive director who's also managing a team, who's also raising all the funds, who's also doing all the public kind of stakeholder interface and managing a board. Like, I think essentially there's a deep empathy for what it means to have to be in the position to ask for resources to do your core work and your core purpose. And, just to wrap up the story I've not been able to finish, I think that's why our grantee partners really encouraged us to go out and be advocates for it. And some of the things they raised up, in addition to some of the grant making practices specifically that are, I think there's a report on, there's a guide on it in the chat, is essentially being trusted partners in actually achieving the kinds of outcomes or the kinds of impacts that they are hoping to have for the communities that they're accountable to as nonprofits. To address a couple of the questions, is it always multi-year? And I think this also answers a question about unconditional trust versus leading with trust in many instances, particularly for under-resourced and underfunded organizations and leaders, which is one of the ways I would sort of shift the frame, which is acknowledging the power that we have to decide as funders. And so when we're making these decisions, how much are we taking it into account? What Shadi named earlier about leaders and groups that are chronically underfunded, as a forward-facing lens of who to begin looking at and who to trust. But in our portfolio, we had both emergent, annual, and multi-year grants. So in a sense, sometimes things would come across our radar that we didn't know about because of referrals, because we tried to have highly diversified referral networks. Or maybe there was a new group and we weren't sure, like, were we a fit for who they are? Were they a fit for who we are? So we would make an annual grant as a way to begin a relationship or begin a dialogue. So instead of putting someone through, a year-long process of applying for a grant to us, going to lunch with us or whatever it is that funders may require before a dime gets dropped, give a grant and then use that grant as an exploration for ultimately fit around, where we are going and how we are going there. And then some of those folks would become then long-term or multi-year grantees. So just to say that there are mechanisms for which we can figure out trustworthiness and trust on both sides. And I just want to name, Yolanda, I want to go back to what you said about, I think that there is a sophistication and a set of core competencies that are required when it's not just about a competition of grant writers, right? Like essentially, when we have a competition for grants, we're sort of saying whoever writes it up the best, whoever has like funds in their communications department to put together great media or great websites. And if you look at the trends in philanthropy of who gets the bulk of the funding, they all have huge development teams. They have communication arms. When you think about a grassroots group or a newer group that has maybe a single staff, 2 or 3 staff, and a bunch of volunteers, who is going to be able to produce that pretty package that's going to win that competition in the ROI? So I think some of the competencies of being a grant maker, both when you're discerning around who really is sort of landing in that center of they are doing work that we are wanting to fund, and like, for instance, independent journalism, we funded ethnic journalism, independent journalism. So who's sort of this at the center of that and doing that work in an underfunded and unseen kind of way? And then I just wanted to name some of the core competencies. I see them. One is understanding our purpose as the grant maker. Like, are we clear on what we're trying to fund, who we're trying to fund? Is it what issue area, what region? Are we clear on what are the criteria of the groups that we're looking for? So being very clear about purpose. And then social, emotional, relational skill sets. So that's the ability to be empathic, to listen, to be in conversation, to come without agendas, to have humility, to be a willing dance partner rather than a drill sergeant in the relationship, right? So that there is actually like a mutual exchange of learning. So there's an exchange, obviously, of funds, but what comes with that in trust-based philanthropy, I think, is that we're in it with you. We're shoulder to shoulder with you. We care about how it is to live inside your organization. What is the experience of your staff? What is the experience of the communities that you're supporting? So I think that's also my last point, 2 points, which is care, like essentially caring. There's a caringness about the humans that we're supporting, and a caringness about what they're trying to achieve, and a caring for the communities that they're accountable to. And then coherence and consistency. So with these competencies, are we showing up pretty coherently with our values? And are we being consistent in showing up in these values? Meaning, if a grantee comes to us and says, hey, you messed up, you funded us for 2 years and we assumed we were going to get multi-year funding from you. And then that 3rd year, you just disappeared and ghosted us. So how willing are we to be consistent in our values and say, wow, we did mess up. We misled you. We didn't communicate well. We were not transparent, and then do something about it. So I think the competencies that we have to build up are more than just kind of the reading literacy of reading grants and reports. It's about being able to be a principled human, empathic and sort of with a critical lens for what we're trying to achieve together in the relationship.
Thank you so much, Pia. I think those are really important competencies to uplift. And maybe we should even create a little resource that flags each of those things that you suggested, because there's such clear embodiments of just the competencies of what it means to be a power conscious funder and how that translates to a deeper and more impactful relationship. We're getting a lot of questions, so we're going to do our best to weave those in. I want to come to you, Yolanda. Really here, in many ways, you represent the perspective of a nonprofit leader running your own nonprofit organization. Your work at Institute for Nonprofit Practice is also supporting hundreds of other nonprofit leaders around the country. So you understand these dynamics personally and professionally. And I'm curious if you could kind of invite, for those who may be a little newer to the distinction between traditional philanthropy and trust-based philanthropy, can you paint a picture for us? What is different for you, like practically, when you have a trust-based relationship with a funder? How does that help you? And how is it different from some more traditional relationships?
Sure. Yeah, I was seeing some questions in the chat just around like practically what does that look like, or giving some examples. And so, I'm happy to share some. I think, You know, when full disclosure, I first learned about trust-based philanthropy from Phil. So we happened to be on this same webinar together. And I remember I went to speak with Phil about work we were going to be doing in New York City. And I was like, so what are you all doing here? And he kind of shared more about this model, and the rest was history. From there on, we kind of took it upon ourselves to go tell every nonprofit leader we worked with that there were funders who were having this dialogue that could open up a whole new way of working together. And so what does that look like? Like practically, if you think about the effects of, you know, when Phil said you could really just submit anything you've submitted, we were like, I don't know if I trust that. Like, is it going to be the right thing we submit? Is it going to, what if like we talk about a project, but really we want general operating funds. And so then they get really connected to this project in our grant. And so it was like, we had to almost in this engagement with Robert Sterling Clark Foundation, unlearn what we've been conditioned to do, which is, you know, only work on the agenda of a funder in order to get funding for our own mission and agenda. But like the funder agenda always came first. And what I think this model allows us to do is actually develop together a shared agenda. We have a collective, you know, we have alignment on changing the community in X, Y, or Z way. So what's the way in which we can leverage funders' dollars, social capital, platforms, networks, in order to achieve that collective goal? It's very different to approach it that way. And so, you know, I think for me, for us, what we've seen open up, certainly there are the benefits of general operating dollars, especially in these last number of years where COVID hit and a racial reckoning and priorities had to shift. There was no time to write up an amended grant proposal or, you know, kind of go through the bureaucracy. Anyone who had these systems already in place, who are funding partners of ours, we moved alongside and with very quickly to respond to community needs. So that's like a very practical outcome in a crisis when you're trusting of one another and you're in a set of practices that have a little bit more adaptability and flexibility, you can respond differently. And then the last thing I'll say, and you know, feel free to dig in a little bit more if I'm not getting concrete enough, but when I think about how we've reported, there's like a grace and an ease that kind of goes with that caringness that Pia just spoke about, but it's a conversation, which I think when we're having chats, which is one of the tools for how to do reporting, and we're having a conversation that's not just the 10 questions that our grant writer perfectly responded to, right? But actually is a real discussion about the opportunities and the successes and challenges our organization has faced in whatever context we're working within. Just so much more opens up between us around how we can support each other. And there's, you know, again, it's like a practice of building trust. And so we learn together and we can admit our, you know, our failures together and figure our way out together in a way that's just much more candid. Hard to do that on a report, to say, you know what, the really bad thing that happened this year was X, Y, and Z, right? That's like something you want to talk about in conversation with someone so they have the context and don't make quick assumptions. So practically, I think there are just ways it's been really transformational for us in relationship to funders. And I know for the leaders we serve who've had this exposure too.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. That was very clear and very practical, and it can allow for people to see what's possible and how it can be different. We got this great question that is a little provocative, but I want to bring it to our panel. One is, well, if we're saying that trust-based philanthropy is not about unconditional trust, what are the conditions? And so, Phil, I want to bring this question to you because you've often talked about trust-based philanthropy. This is not about trust for likability or trust for friendship. It's trust for impact. And so what do you mean by that? And then how do you even like assess or establish the conditions of the relationship once you start from a place of trust? How do you kind of assess whether the trust-based relationship is moving in the direction you were hoping it would go?
Right. And just your starting point, the trust for likability and trust for friendship, I think that's one of the assumptions that many people make, not everybody, but there's an assumption. And I think that's where we equate trust in this, or trust-based philanthropy, is like the way that we look at friendship, right? And that's not the case, right? We talk about trust for impact or trust for action. And so we believe, or we trust that you will do what you say that you're working to do toward, or aiming to do. And that's where our trust comes in, right? And that's what we're looking for when we are actually going through our due diligence process, and understanding is we're trying to understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. You know, part of it comes back to like, so what do we think about the ability to execute, the resources you have at hand, the strategy that you put in place, the team that you have, right? I think some folks forget there's this whole due diligence process that is part of trust-based. And there's this notion like, oh, we like you, so we're just going to give you money. That's the funding part is the very last part of this. The whole idea is like, we do all this due diligence and we do this homework ahead of time or before we make the grant, so that when it comes time to give you and make those funds available, that we sort of say, please decide how to use these funds, because we've done our homework and we believe that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. And so for us, that's how that kind of unfolds in that way, in terms of really doing the homework up front, right? And do the homework is the second of the 6 practices that's in place. But really sort of making sure that that our grantee partners have the flexibility and the wherewithal to make the decisions. And we live in a dynamic world, right? That if we made a grant in 2019, by the time we got to 2020, everything was flipped upside down. But so like, keep doing what you're going to do. And so that's how we look at that from our point of view.
Thank you so much, Phil. Pia, what are your reflections on this question of what are the conditions, or what are we looking for in a trust-based relationship with a nonprofit?
Thanks for this question. And I agree with all of what you said, Phil. I think it's also making sure that we, as the foundation or the donor or the funder, we're very clear about what we're funding and why. So that is an internal process, sometimes, and we all, we've included grantee partners and other social movement partners in that process at times, but that we have clarity about that, because without that clarity from us and an understanding of how that evolves and iterates and changes over time as things shift, then it would be really hard to say what the parameters are. For us, it was that we were still on the same page about the kinds of change we were trying to make in the world, that we were on the same page that the how is important. So for us, we really intended to fund and did fund collaborative leadership in many instances. This sector rewards charismatic individual leadership over and over again. There's that phrase funder darling. So there's like, Van Jones or whoever, Ai-jen Poo, they become a funder darling. And then everyone is sort of like throwing their money at these like incredible visionaries, but also singular leaders in many ways. So we were looking for, smaller outfits that practice collaborative leadership, that were consistent in not just what they were trying to achieve with communities, but how they were doing it, meaning they were being trust-based. Right? Like they were actually operating in an accountable, trustworthy way with their communities and those that they felt like they were their stakeholders. So that's something that was part of like what would keep us in a long-term relationship, is that we continue to kind of hit those marks. And like Phil said, it wasn't just because we liked someone. I mean, there were certainly some relationships that developed into friendships with my grantees and many that did not. I think some of the other parameters to know are when do we fall out of a trust relationship? And I think that happened a couple times where in one instance, there was a leader, an executive director decided to move on to another job. Happens all the time. We love funding transition. We highly support continuing to fund organizations beyond and through transitions, especially executive ones. But in one instance, the board took like 18 months to determine a new executive director. And after 18 months, and with a lot of funds, actually in external search processes, the board chair was appointed, basically self-appointed as the new executive director. And something about that process felt very off to us. It didn't feel ethical or principled. And so we had to ask ourselves, whoa, that was, do we have another couple years with this group that we committed to? Maybe it was just 1 year. But they were, so we spoke with them and had a process of, saying that this landed, that just didn't land well, to use organizational resources to just make a internal appointment to the board. So I think there's something about coherence again. Like, is there a coherence around the values with which we're espousing, but also the grantee partner is practicing? And we want them to point it out when we're not practicing in a coherent way or a consistent way. And we want it to be okay that we point that out as well. Not necessarily as punitive. We didn't actually pull the last year of funding. We actually gave 1 more year funding and even a transition out grant. But we talked about why we decided to transition out of the relationship at that point. Especially with, bringing the feedback back to the board was very challenging, and they were very sort of protective and defensive of their process. So, I think it's important to tell stories of when trust is broken and when it can be repaired and when it sort of cannot be repaired. And Phil and Yolanda have both indicated, we're talking about human relationships of trust. So we kind of know, hopefully in our just regular lives, intuitively, what does it look like? And I think the other thing about it is transparency, being incredibly transparent about who and what and why we're funding, especially if we're not doing open ROIs. And I see there's a question about that in the chat. And then being open and transparent about why we're moving away from funding. And then being really transparent with those that approach us that we never fund at all. So I think those are ways that we can cultivate trustworthiness as a funder. And that there are, each institution might have their different points of discernment, but we had, a set of things that we were sort of consistently looking for that we also hope to live up to in the relationship.
Thank you so much, Pia. That is really helpful. I'm looking at our time and I want to make sure we get to a few key questions. I'm also seeing some questions around just some of the legal requirements in funding nonprofits, and really the only legal requirement is that an organization is a 501c3 or a project of a 501c3. That's the only legal requirement. And as a foundation, as a grant maker, you are legally permitted to give unrestricted funding. And as you know, or as you may know, the legal requirements around using funds for lobbying is 5%. I believe it's 5%. Nonprofits cannot use more than 5% of their funding to do any lobbying. But as a funder, if you are giving an unrestricted grant, you are handing over all liability of decision-making around funding to that organization. So even if they end up, going beyond the 5%, you as a funder are no longer liable because it's in the stipulation of an unrestricted grant. We have a guide on the legal considerations of trust-based philanthropy that was co-developed with a nonprofit attorney, Jean Tom. Eleni Rafu on our team had shared that in the chat. We can share it again. We'll also share it after this program so you can get a sense of some of those kind of core legal requirements just to make sure that you are compliant with those things. We're not suggesting anything that is, going that's working out of the box when it comes to the legal requirements. Thanks for giving me that intermission to address that question because I saw some questions around it. I do want to get at this question. I really appreciated that story from you, Pia, about an instance where you saw misalignment and that invited you and your co-ED to question whether there was a fit anymore in that funding relationship. So that's a moment where you're using kind of your ethics and your values as a gauge to determine whether that relationship should continue. Phil and then Yolanda, I would love for you both to share an instance, and maybe Phil, just starting with you, do you have examples of a time when the trust was weakened in a relationship with a grantee, and how were you able to navigate through that?
No, it's a great question. There are lots of different, and there are some instances of that. I think for us, and like, and I would go back to kind of me as an individual, but when someone has lied or has been deceitful in an intentional way, that's a really strong breach of trust. And so the easy response is like, well, we're done with you, is kind of the easy way. But the other way for us is to be curious. So like, what is it that prompted that, and why did that come out the way that it did? And in some ways, the instance I'm thinking about, it was really in the interest of like preserving their funding, to say that we didn't deliver, or we didn't result, or we didn't quite hit the mark, felt worse than just lying. And part of me was like, wow, that's really not a good thing. And part of me is like, in some ways, like, maybe I can understand part of that, because the funding is so important and so core, and you're feeling very vulnerable, and being able to share that it wasn't what you thought it was going to be is a fail. And actually, for us, the fail was actually not being truthful, and not the other way around. And so we really did have this conversation with this organization and talk about, like, how do we repair this, or how do we go forward in a way that is actually resonant and meaningful to both of us, that we still think that we can work and partner together. And that was it was a tough conversation. It was a tough series of conversations, because the organization honestly felt like, well, we're done, so why are we going to engage in this conversation to just be essentially be uncomfortable or tortured, if you will. And so I think it's in a weird sense, it's a manifestation of the way that granting and funding and the power dynamic plays out, right? And it's sort of reinforce this trust-based approach is going to be a better one for us, or was a better way for us to do that, and to see and to show how it can be done differently, and how we can partner, and how we can talk about things that we're struggling with or not. But really being honest about that, right? And I think that's one of the things that we share with our own board, is that often right now we're getting better information because we have grantee partners who are willing to show kind of their warts as well as their successes with us. And so we have a sense and an understanding of what's really happening out there, as opposed to this kind of rose-colored glasses of lens of like everything is just stucky. And so I guess the resolution in that one was the outcome was good or promising, because we were able to have that hard conversation and really kind of work through some of the challenges that happened in that situation.
Thank you so much for sharing that story, Phil. Coming to you, Yolanda, I'm curious what this is bringing up for you, just kind of hearing this, from the nonprofit perspective. And if you have any examples of times when you've had weakened trust with a funder, and how if and how you were able to navigate through that as a nonprofit.
Yeah, I think the ability to navigate through the circumstances that I can speak for personally really depended on the relationship with the funder, right? And I think about, just as a little context, I started at INP almost 10 years ago, and we were a 2-person shop. It was me and our founder. And I had zero trust in the funding trust bank. I had no experience fundraising. I had none of the social capital that other people might come into the job with. And so it was an incredibly difficult first few years to find a path to building trusting relationships with funders, and have people not just see, the work we were doing in the moment, but the possibility for what our work could look like later. And that continues to be a struggle, right? Because once you hit a certain size, then people will say you're overfunded. And so I just want to name that, like, really important to not just fund small organizations, because there are many of us in our current roles who've grown organizations. And what I've found in the more recent examples of where trust was broken is where funders made assumptions about our financial status because we were scaling. And so they cut back funding without giving us a heads up, or they maybe gave us a sense that they were going to grow with us, and then they gave us level funding without any communication, or they decided they were going to change strategy and approach, and that just came through in the final decision of our grant process. And in all of those instances, like, what I had wished was that funders just told us in advance, right? Gave us the grace and the dignity and the trust to handle that things change and strategies change and priorities change. And so to let us in advance, I think sometimes it's the intention to not disappoint that then leads funders to not be candid, but then that breaks trust, right? It's like, you're trying to do something good. You don't want to disappoint people. You just put them through the process like everyone else. But actually, the process is really burdensome and laborious. And especially for those of us who have tiny teams and tiny development teams, it can be even more challenging. So I just think, broken communication and communication not happening in advance as we go can be really difficult. And I just caution people as we're looking ahead, and I know funders are really thinking about level funding, cutting back funding, preparing for a recession. Like, be honest, tell people where you're at, help your grantees get ready. We're building a whole series right now for the course of next year for our leaders to get ready for these times, and they should have been getting ready, right? But like, we owe it to each other to be in that dialogue so that at the very least, our relationships are whole. Funding isn't the only foundation for trust. And certainly I have a lot of funder friends who don't fund us, but I know that I can trust them and rely on them to be in social change work with me in other ways. So.
That's really beautifully put, and I couldn't agree more. Thank you for naming that it's not only existing when there's a money exchange. Really appreciate that point. So we're at time, but I do want to give our panelists one final reflection to share with the group. And there is one question around how to make the case for trust-based philanthropy, especially among executive teams or boards that still feel really strongly that trust is earned and that these practices are way too radical. So what's a door opening for that? I know it's a big question that you probably need more time to answer, but any reflections you want to offer on that, or any final invitations that you have for people on our call who are interested in deepening more trust-based relationships with partners. And we will start with you, Pia, and then Phil, and then Yolanda, and then we'll move on to Shantias.
Thank you, Shadi. Thanks, everyone. This question of how to basically manage up if we're not in the decision-making position comes to us a lot. Strategies that I know have worked is bringing in an external trustee, like a trustee or an executive or staff from another respected organization. That seems to be the peer, that sort of peer kind of modeling of someone being very authentic and saying how they've given up power as a trustee in terms of specific grants, or they've given up power as an executive around sharing power with staff around, big decisions or strategies or managing the board. I've seen that work in a lot of different occasions. It's sort of that thing where you could be inside the organization and saying something and sending articles, but then somehow some random person, who's not associated with you at all, but, has some kind of, we respect their institution or their funding area or something like that, can be a good influence. So I'd say that's one place to start. Just my last comment on this unconditional trust is, a level of discernment that, I think unconditional trust sort of sounds like you're not paying attention to anything and you're just sort of shooting money out of a cannon the way we do at t-shirts at a stadium or something. And I think that sort of compromises, the sense of purpose that I hope we all have in this work, and the sense of honor and dignity about the groups of people we're supporting. So I'd say, my final thoughts on it are infusing the question even with a sense of what does it look like to have discernment, and what does it look like to offer dignity to people who are our current partners, or people we may never fund, or people we may even stop funding. But that concept, Yolanda, of dignity really sticks with me as a sort of a core value that we are trying to sort of offer to our nonprofit partners.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Pia. Phil, the question comes to you. Any advice for those who are trying to invite peers or colleagues to understand the value of trust-based philanthropy? What would you offer, or an action step that you would suggest?
I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is this notion of trying an experiment, or taking like a couple grants or a program area within the larger foundation and trying and seeing what would it mean to try and implement some of these trust-based practices, whether it's a streamlined application, or whether everything is unrestricted funding, or whether there's a different kind of reporting mechanism that comes with that. And just sort of see and sort of like, so how is this different, or what does this feel like? And to what extent do we feel like this is good, bad, ugly, and different, and then sharing that back with your board. And so you're not making a full-fledged commitment to trust-based or this, but you're going to say, we're going to dip our toe in and sort of see what this feels like, and then report back. And I think that's an interesting way to gather a lot of good information, or some information that will help inform perhaps the way that you choose to move forward, or maybe step away, or say, hey, parts of this work for us, but if we add a couple of these other tweaks, maybe it'll even feel stronger, more consistent with the way that we want to do our grant making. So that's probably what I would offer as a thing to do.
That's a great practical offering. Thank you, Phil. Yolanda, final reflections for our participants today.
Yeah, I would just build off of that and say, as we have continued to help bring trust-based philanthropy out through our networks, what I've seen funders do who have practiced some pilots is they've communicated really transparently to grantees, to us, to say, hey, we're trying some new things out, and they've asked for our feedback along the way. So it wasn't like all of a sudden we're trust-based philanthropy, and that's what we do. Because I actually think sometimes people put the cart before the horse, and then they say that, and they're not actually implementing all of the practices. And then that causes a lot more distrust, right, from the grantee. So say you're learning, say you're trying, ask for feedback. And I think for folks who haven't really tried, especially things like turning the reporting into a conversation, you'll be really surprised by how much more you learn, but also how fulfilled program officers are. Because I see that in my engagement with my program officers for different foundations, how just we leave in tears, with joy, with enthusiasm for the work we're going to do together. And like, you definitely won't get that from a paragraph I write in a report. So I just think if you try these things, it's hard to say that it doesn't work and it isn't really effective in building collaboration for change.
That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you to our fabulous panelists. We appreciate you so much. We are over time, so I am going to quickly hand it back over to my lovely colleague, Shantias Ford, to walk us through next steps.
Thank you so much to these lovely panelists, Pia, Yolanda, Phil, Shadi, for shepherding that conversation. I'm sure you all saw the chat going wild, Twitter going wild, people asking questions, people engaging. We're so grateful for everybody for your attendance. We're not done yet, so please don't jump off. Just a few key takeaways from this conversation to make sure you're actually stepping away with some of those main points that we've tried to bring out. Of course, as we mentioned before, this is not a yes or no type of answer, but there is nuance, there's details, there's recommendations. And so just to give you some of those key takeaway points, trust-based philanthropy does not advocate for unconditional trust. We talked about trust for impact versus trust for likability, and really building those strong relationships and starting with trust, leading from trust with your potential grantee partners and with partners that you already have. We talked about trust and accountability being a two-way street. Not only are grantees accountable to us, but we're also accountable to our grantees. And it's a mutual relationship that we should both come into seeking to support each other and partner with each other and thinking about the parameters to a successful relationship that both of us, both parties should withhold. We talked about historically the default in philanthropy being distrust first. And we talked about some of the racial aspects of that for marginalized communities, for Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color. That's been the default. And so we're pushing for a shift there, for a shift to start with trust and to do the homework, as we mentioned, some of our practices, do the homework to understand who the best partners would be, and then start with trust and understand, trust that they can do what you've trusted them to do. Trust requires cultivation and maintenance. This is not to just set it and forget it. Part of that is continuously having transparency, continuously building those relationships. It takes time, just like any personal relationship you would have. Trust is built over time. And as it was mentioned, it's easy for it to be ripped from under you once that distrust happens. But it's also important to have those conversations and to see what the underlying reason why trust may have been broken, what that was, and how to repair that, or how to move forward from that. And then finally, a foundation of trust strengthens our ability to work through moments when trust may be challenged or weakened. As we've talked about, it's all about relationships, and we want to have strong, transparent, trusting relationships with our grantees. So just a few key takeaways there for you to grapple with. Continue to throw your questions. We're saving the chat. We're following up with people. We're taking some of these things. I know a lot of you were also talking about things that we're planning for future sessions. So that's just a reason for you to come back to some other sessions that we have coming up to get those questions answered. We know it's a lot. And so we're trying to be very specific and targeted in the conversations we're having to make sure we can cover this, and then we'll go on and cover the next thing. So we just appreciate your engagement and your participation. And we want to have that closing poll. Now that we've had this conversation, we want to revisit that poll that we initially had. So if my colleague can pull that up, how confident are you that you can answer the question? Now that you've heard from us, you've heard from the panelists, you've seen it in action, you've got quite a few different resources. How confident are you that you can answer that question? Does trust-based philanthropy mean unconditional trust? Can we pull that? There we go. Awesome. So if people can answer that question, and I know people are falling off, but we still have more to come. So hopefully you'll stay on, answer this question. I'm already seeing a stark difference in the answers. So that's lovely to my evaluation ears. And just in general, it's great to hear that there's more clarity there on how to answer the question. It looks like about 80% are very confident in being able to answer this question in detail, and about 21% are somewhat confident, and many, I'll say 2 people are not confident. So feel free to continue to reach out to us, to the staff, if you have further questions on this topic you like discussed or clarified. For the sake of time, we are going to transition into the next part of this series, in this program. Let me just share the results really quickly. We ended up with about 78% are very confident and about 21% are somewhat confident. So great to hear that clarity happening for folks. And so now we're going to go into our breakout discussions. We have 19 lovely PSO partners, give or take. I know some are going to keep people in the main room, but our philanthropy serving organization partners have partnered with us, and we have a facilitators section that they're going to be leading you in discussion as you grapple with some of these aspects in more detail. So if you're not affiliated with the PSO, you can either stay here in the main room, or you can go to one in whichever maybe region or topic area you're affiliated with. So maybe you're not involved with Philanthropy New York, but you live in New York. So maybe it's an opportunity for you to jump in there and engage with that PSO. So we encourage you to do that. If you are having trouble, if you're having tech issues, and you don't see the pop-up, there's going to be a pop-up for you to join a breakout room. Most of you, if you register with your PSO, you're going to automatically be populated there. But if you have trouble, we ask that you put it in the chat. The staff are going to be on deck trying to sort people out and put people into rooms. But if you speak, we don't know who's talking. And so it's easier for you to just put it in the chat. We're going to like your comment, and that means we're putting you in the right room. So if you can just put, can you put me in this room? Can you put me in that room? And I'll actually pull up the PSO partner list so you can see that in full detail. We also ask for you to complete the evaluation. Please, 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 this is so helpful for us as we're designing future programming. Please offer any feedback, good, the bad, the ugly. Hopefully you had a great time, but if not, we'll take all of that into consideration. And again, the resources and the recordings are going to be shared out to you. It's also going to be posted on our website for you to follow up with anything you missed. And we'll see you at the next session, which will be on May 11th. And it will be about unrestricted funding, as we've talked about, as we alluded to. So this is the end of this part. You won't come back into the main room after you finish with your breakout. So